Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are really thrilled to have you here with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and we've got a lot to cover.
We really do. Hooking you right from the start here, I need to announce today's mission because it is an absolutely massive one.
Massive is almost an understatement for this one.
Right. We are unpacking a highly provocative, newly published 2025 ebook. It's titled Feminist Evil Turning Women into Men by Conrad Riker.
Which is a title that really sets the tone immediately.
Exactly. And look, if you are looking to understand the history of our modern institutions, how they operate today, and how the author claims they have been fundamentally captured by feminists and Marxists over the past few decades.
The institutional capture is a huge theme in this book.
It is the core of it. So if you want to understand that shift, this deep dive is going to be ultra long, it's going to be incisive, and completely fascinating.
It really is a dense and honestly an uncompromising text. We're going to be dissecting the core arguments laid out in this book, walking through the author's entire worldview to understand exactly how he connects human evolutionary biology to our modern socio-political landscape.
Yeah.
Because this is a text that attempts to deconstruct almost every major cultural shift of the last 50 years.
And I really want to speak directly to you, our listener right now, especially the men tuning in who are actively seeking to understand the rapidly shifting dynamics of modern society.
Right, the men who are following the growing influence of the manosphere.
Exactly, the manosphere and the perspectives driving men's rights advocates today. We are going to thoroughly unpack the data, the historical anecdotes, and the overarching arguments laid out in this book to give you a really comprehensive, detailed overview of Conrad Riker's framework.
Because you really need to see the whole framework to get what he's saying.
You do. This book touches on the most heated, intense cultural debates of our time. And to be absolutely clear up front, and I cannot stress this enough, our job today isn't to endorse these views.
No, not at all.
We aren't taking a side or validating these claims as absolute truth because the source material contains highly politically and culturally charged content. We are strictly acting as your impartial guides here.
We're basically objective reporters today.
That's it. We are objectively reporting on the ideas, the statistics, and the arguments exactly as they are contained in the original source material. We want to help you understand the mechanics of the worldview this author is presenting, so you can just analyze the arguments for yourself.
And that analytical lens is totally crucial for a text like this. We are here to synthesize the material, map out the underlying logic the author uses to build his case.
Yeah.
Whether you find his arguments compelling or, highly controversial, understanding the specific data points and the historical interpretations he relies on, it's essential for grasping the broader cultural conversation happening right now.
Absolutely. Now, before we jump into the first major concept, please take a quick moment to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive.
It really helps us out.
It does. It helps us keep bringing you these in-depth explorations week after week. Also, if you want to read the source material for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Highly recommend reading the primary source.
Always. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to see more of his writings.
So let's lay out the roadmap.
Yeah, let's get into it. Our roadmap for today is extensive. We'll start by exploring the author's foundational premise regarding evolutionary biology and what he calls the Great Swap.
Which is a fascinating concept.
Then we'll examine his detailed claims about the alleged institutional capture of academia, media, and corporate America.
Right.
After that, we're going to analyze his very harsh critique of the family court system, dive into his theories on the physical and chemical environment's impact on men, and finally,
we'll unpack his proposed solutions.
Exactly, the solutions in a section he terms a masculine restoration. So let's start at the foundation.
The foundation of Riker's entire book rests on a total rejection of the idea that gender is a social construct.
He does not mince words on that.
Not at all. He spends the early chapters fiercely arguing that human behavior, mating strategies, societal roles, they are all dictated by hardwired biological realities.
And he leans heavily into evolutionary psychology to build this case.
He does. He makes frequent references to the work of David Buss. The centerpiece of this argument is Buss's landmark study spanning 37 different cultures around the globe.
Buss's study of those 37 cultures really is the bedrock of his argument here. Riker uses it to claim that this specific biological drive isn't culturally conditioned, it's universal.
Right, across the board.
Yeah. He points out that whether you are looking at an industrialized Western nation, a rural agrarian society, or a completely isolated tribal group, The fundamental mating preferences remain strikingly consistent.
And the core claim the book extracts from this data is that women are biologically wired for a concept called hypergamy.
Let's define that because he uses it a lot.
Yeah, the author defines hypergamy in strictly evolutionary terms. It is the instinctual, subconscious drive to seek out partners who possess high status, abundant resources, and the physical dominance necessary to provide for and protect offspring.
He takes it right back to the savannah.
Exactly. The book argues that we have to look at this through the lens of ancestral humans on the savannah, because ancestral women faced immense, life-threatening physical burdens during pregnancy, childbirth, and, years of nursing.
So their choice of mate was literal survival.
It was a matter of literal survival. Selecting a weak, low-status, or resource-poor mate was essentially a death sentence for their genetic line.
Wow.
Therefore, Riker argues, the female brain evolved this ruthless filtering mechanism. It's programmed to constantly look up the social and competence hierarchy.
And building on that, the book spends an equal amount of time defining male evolutionary wiring to show how the two halves of this biological equation interact.
Right, the other side of the coin.
Riker claims that men are biologically wired for protection, provision, intense risk-taking, and spreading their genetics across a wider pool.
He brings testosterone into it heavily.
He does. He argues that male brains, which are heavily bathed in testosterone in utero development straight through puberty, they evolved to navigate complex spatial challenges, to build durable structures, and compete aggressively within dominance hierarchies.
The logic here is that men are driven to secure the exact resources and status that women are hardwired to desire.
It's a lock and key mechanism for him.
Exactly. The author posits that this dynamic is not the result of centuries of cultural brainwashing or patriarchal social conditioning. He says it's the fundamental, unalterable firmware of the human species.
Firmware is a good word for how he describes it.
Yeah, he insists that you cannot legislate or educate away hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure that forged these distinct complementary behaviors.
And this biological baseline is exactly what sets up his next major argument. He takes that ancient savannah programming and applies it directly to what he calls the digital savannah.
The dating apps.
Yes. This is his term for modern dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, OkCupid. It's a fascinating pivot because he argues that these apps haven't created any new human behaviors.
They've just magnified them.
Right. Instead of creating new behaviors, they've stripped away the social friction of the real world and exposed our raw, primal wiring on a massive algorithmic scale.
Riker uses the data generated by these platforms to illustrate his concept of hypergamy operating on steroids.
Yeah, steroids is the perfect way to put it.
Historically, mating was constrained by geography, right? By community. A woman in a small village would choose the most competent man available within her immediate physical proximity.
You only had a few options.
Exactly. But the author points out that dating apps remove those social constraints entirely. They give women the illusion of limitless global choice.
An infinite catalog.
And when handed that infinite catalog, he argues, their evolutionary firmware kicks in and ruthlessly filters out the vast majority of the male population.
The statistics he cites from these platforms are staggering. He points to data suggesting that 80% of women on these dating apps swipe right on only the top 4.5% to 10% of men.
Let that sink in.
It's wild. This means the vast majority of female attention is hyper-focused on a tiny, tiny fraction of the male user base.
The top tier men.
Yeah, the book claims that these top-tier men, the ones possessing the algorithmic ideal of height, sharp jawlines, visible markers of wealth or high status, they effectively hoard all the romantic and sexual attention.
And this creates a severe imbalance in the dating market, which Riker uses to explain the modern male experience.
The digital ghosts concept.
Right. While that top percentage of men enjoys unprecedented access, the author states that average everyday men who historically would have been reliable providers and fathers in their local communities, they are reduced to what he calls digital ghosts.
He illustrates this with a very specific anecdote about an engineer friend of his.
Oh yeah, this part was rough.
It's a brutal story. This guy is described as having a good job, being reasonably fit, generally a solid person. And according to the book, this engineer systematically swiped right on 500 profiles over the course of a month.
500.
And the result of that massive effort was exactly 3 matches.
Unbelievable.
2 of those turned out to be automated bots trying to sell him something, and the single real woman who matched with him ghosted him after exchanging just 1 message.
And Riker frames this not as an isolated run of bad luck.
No, not at all. He frames it as a systemic, mathematically predictable reality of modern dating, driven by unconstrained hypergamy.
The book connects this overwhelming rejection directly to a phenomenon he terms the modern marriage strike.
This is a huge concept in the manosphere.
It is. Riker argues that men are fundamentally rational actors who are constantly making a return on investment or ROI calculation.
An economic view of dating?
Precisely.
Yeah.
If the modern dating market is biologically and algorithmically rigged so that the average man is statistically invisible and structurally ignored, then opting out of traditional courtship and marriage is a perfectly rational response.
And Riker is very adamant that the marriage strike is not about men simply giving up out of laziness or, a refusal to grow up.
Which is how mainstream media usually portrays it.
Exactly, the Peter Pan syndrome trope. He completely rejects that. He frames it as a strategic, calculated withdrawal from a game where the rules are fundamentally stacked against them by female biological selectivity.
He asks a really pointed question here.
He asks, why should an average man exhaust his resources, his time, and his emotional energy participating in a system that views him as a disposable ghost?
That same concept of a system ignoring innate biological realities leads into his analysis of the workplace.
Ah, yes, the chapter he dubs the Great Swap.
Riker asserts that over the last few decades, institutions have actively pushed women into male-dominated corporate engineering and leadership roles while simultaneously pushing men out.
Or demanding that the corporate culture become entirely feminized.
Right, and he argues this goes directly against the grain of human biology. He uses highly visible corporate disasters to claim that prioritizing diversity and inclusion over raw meritocratic competence leads to literal catastrophe.
He really does not hold back on the examples here. He points directly to the aviation industry, specifically analyzing the devastating Boeing 737 MAX crashes and the troubled development of the 777X project.
His interpretation of those events is very specific.
Very. He claims that internal corporate directives heavily prioritize diversity quotas and the promotion of female leadership over the retention of experienced, veteran male engineers who had spent decades mastering the specific nuances of aerospace design.
The author's underlying premise here relies on his earlier point about male neurobiology.
The spatial cognitive mastery.
Exactly. He argues that spatial cognitive mastery and a ruthless, unfeeling focus on mechanical function are biologically male advantages.
Unfeeling focus, yeah.
When a corporation decides to replace that hyper-focused competence with a mandate for gender parity and social representation, Riker claims the result is severely compromised engineering.
He essentially argues that the planes literally fell from the sky because the company swapped out an objective competence hierarchy for a social justice hierarchy.
And he traces this exact same alleged dynamic through Silicon Valley.
The Theranos scandal.
Yes, focusing heavily on Theranos and its founder, Elizabeth Holmes. Riker argues that the venture capital class and the media establishment were so desperate to crown a female founder as the next Steve Jobs that they collectively abandoned all objective scrutiny.
They just wanted the narrative.
Right. He points out that investors poured nearly $700 million into a company that was fundamentally based on showmanship and narrative rather than functional, verified technology.
The key detail he highlights from the Theranos saga is the treatment of the male engineers and the whistleblowers.
This part is crucial to his point.
The book claims that when technically proficient male employees pointed out that the core blood testing technology was a physical impossibility, that it was a fraud, they were not listened to.
They were dismissed as toxic.
Yes, labeled as toxic, labeled as not being team players, and brushed aside by the exact same diversity-focused advisors and board members who were championing Holmes's public image.
Riker uses Theranos as a microcosm for his broader thesis.
That men build and systemize.
Exactly, that men are biologically wired to build, to systemize, and to prioritize unyielding function, whereas he claims modern corporate diversity initiatives prioritize feelings, optics, and representation above all else.
He brings up another tech example, too, with the spectacular failure of the Amazon Fire Phone.
Oh yeah, the Fire Phone.
He also claims this product flopped massively because its development was driven by bean counters and human resources departments intent on ticking diversity boxes rather than being driven by the obsessive male engineers utilizing their innate spatial and technical abilities.
The abilities that built the early tech giants in the first place, according to him.
Right. He repeatedly hammers home the idea that competence hierarchies are heavily male-dominated for deep-seated biological reasons, and subverting them courts inevitable systemic failure.
Which naturally raises the question of what happens to the women who do successfully climb these newly constructed corporate ladders.
And this is where he introduces the concept of fertility fraud.
Fertility fraud and the resulting societal birth dearth. His argument is that female career ambition, especially in hyper-competitive corporate environments, is in direct biological competition with reproduction.
Riker states very bluntly that you cannot negotiate with the biological clock.
He points to nations that have aggressively pushed for total gender equality in the workplace, using them as stark cautionary tales.
Sweden is his primary example here.
Yes, he cites Sweden, a country frequently heralded as the ultimate feminist utopia, noting that despite massive state support for working mothers, their birth rate has dropped to 1.6.
Which is dangerously below the population replacement level of 2.1.
Exactly. And he pairs the Swedish data with an analysis of Japan. He observes that in Japan, the rise of what are termed herbivore men.
Men who have completely abandoned the traditional high-stress corporate provider role.
Right. Their rise has coincided with a birth rate crashing down to 1.3. Riker interprets this to mean that when men drop out of the competence hierarchy and women are pushed into it, the fundamental biological mechanism for family formation breaks down completely.
The anecdotes he shares from the corporate world are meant to be a harsh reality check. He details interviews with highly successful corporate women, such as a vice president at Goldman Sachs, who spent their 20s and early 30s prioritizing the boardroom.
Outworking their peers, building immense wealth.
Exactly. But according to the book, these same women inevitably hit what he calls the fertility cliff at age 35.
The author describes a very grim scenario for these executives. They find themselves frantically relying on incredibly expensive and physically taxing IVF treatments.
Facing statistically high rates of permanent childlessness.
Yes, and according to his cited data, suffering from elevated rates of clinical depression and reliance on SSRI medications.
Riker's ultimate conclusion here is that women have been sold a massive generational lie.
They were told they could have it all.
The corner office and the family. But in reality, he argues their core biological imperative for motherhood is being ruthlessly sacrificed for corporate utility and economic output.
And this ties back perfectly into his theory on hypergamy.
Because it doesn't turn off.
Exactly. Riker argues that by the time these highly successful female executives reach their late 30s and are finally ready to settle down, their hypergamous instincts do not suddenly turn off. They still biologically demand a partner who is higher status and earns even more than they do.
But statistically, the pool of men who out-earn a female Goldman Sachs VP is incredibly small.
Tiny. This creates a sociological bottleneck. The author claims that these career women are forced into one of two outcomes. They either remain single and deeply unfulfilled, missing out on family entirely, or they're forced to settle for a man who makes less money than they do.
A man they biologically cannot respect, in his view.
Right. Riker argues this lack of biological respect inevitably leads to a dead bedroom, deep resentment, and eventual divorce. He frames this entire dynamic as feminism's ultimate cruel betrayal of women's true nature.
That brings us to the second major theme of the book. If biology is the unshakable foundation of human behavior, this next section is about how the author believes modern society actively and intentionally attacks that foundation.
He calls it the institutional war on boys and men.
Yes, let's look at academia and what Riker explicitly labels the indoctrination pipeline. He argues that from the moment boys enter the school system, their natural biological behavior is pathologized.
The book paints a picture of modern primary classrooms as environments that are inherently hostile to boyish energy.
Hostile is the exact word he uses.
The author claims that the typical behaviors of young males, their competitiveness, their need for physical roughhousing, their high kinetic energy, their focus on objects over people, they are no longer viewed as normal developmental phases.
Instead, the educational establishment treats these traits as behavioral disorders that need to be aggressively managed and cured.
Riker points directly to the skyrocketing rates of ADHD diagnoses in young boys. He argues that schools are fundamentally female-centric environments, prioritizing compliance, sitting still, and emotional sharing.
And when energetic boys naturally fail to conform to this standard, the author claims the system forces them onto amphetamines like Ritalin.
He provocatively refers to this process as chemically castrating their natural masculine drive.
Just to domesticate them so they are easier for female teachers to manage. It's a heavy accusation.
The specific anecdotes he provides are selected to illustrate the absurdity and hostility of this environment. For example, he details the story of a young boy in Minnesota who faced severe disciplinary action and suspension simply for doodling a picture of a soldier holding a rifle in his notebook.
Riker contrasts this by claiming that if a young girl were to draw activist art, perhaps depicting a burning police station during a protest, she would likely be praised by the same administration for her civic engagement.
He shares another story about a third-grade boy who had an empathy badge revoked by his teacher.
I remember this one, the boys' offense.
He won a schoolyard foot race too dominantly and had the audacity to smile and celebrate when he crossed the finish line,
Which the teacher decided was insensitive to the feelings of the children who lost.
The author views this as a direct assault on the natural male instinct to compete, to win, and to establish hierarchy. And he traces this suppression all the way up the educational ladder into major universities.
Yes, he targets higher education by pointing to initiatives like the one at the University of Toronto, which he claims spent $3.7 million on a program to decolonize math.
Decolonize math. Riker views mathematics and objective, systemizing logic as disciplines deeply aligned with the male brain's natural predispositions.
To him, an attempt to decolonize math is actually an attempt to dismantle objective truth and replace it with subjective emotional frameworks, effectively pushing men out of the exact fields where they biologically excel.
To contrast this alleged Western suppression, the author points to educational models he believes actually work for boys by working with their biology.
He brings up Finland here.
He notes that Finland, which spent years pushing highly progressive, gender-neutral education policies, eventually saw their standardized test scores drop significantly, particularly among boys.
Riker claims they have had to quietly reevaluate and reverse some of those strategies to re-engage male students.
He also uses a fascinating anthropological example from Uganda.
A hunting example.
Yeah, the book claims that young boys in certain Ugandan tribes who are taught traditional hands-on hunting skills naturally develop highly advanced spatial geometry and calculus-like tracking abilities without ever sitting in a formal classroom.
Because their education directly aligns with their biological predispositions to track, hunt, and calculate distance and trajectory.
He warns that because the current Western academic model refuses to accommodate male biology, we are seeing a mass exodus of men from higher education.
He cites the stark statistic that male college enrollment has plummeted to just 40%, arguing that men are simply abandoning a system that views their very nature as a problem to be fixed.
This alleged marginalization of men in schools leads directly into one of the most compelling concepts in the book.
The toxicity trap and the empathy double-bind.
This is where Riker examines the massive hypocrisy in how society treats working-class men versus the expectations placed on modern corporate men.
He starts by looking at the incredibly dangerous jobs that actually keep civilization functioning.
The author points out a deeply uncomfortable disparity in workplace safety that rarely gets mainstream attention. Citing official OSHA data, he notes that men account for a staggering 93% to 97% of all workplace fatalities.
97%. These are the men working on high-pressure oil rigs, roofing houses in extreme heat, fishing in freezing, treacherous waters, running into burning buildings.
Riker argues that society completely depends on men performing these incredibly dangerous body-breaking tasks. We rely entirely on their physical strength, their stoicism, and their biological risk tolerance to keep the lights on and the roads paved.
Yet, the author points out the incredible irony. The exact same society that utterly depends on this visceral, masculine sacrifice routinely labels those exact same traits as toxic masculinity in any other context.
Which brings us to the core of the double-bind matrix.
This is a really tricky concept.
Riker argues that modern culture, particularly through the lens of psychology and HR departments, constantly tells men to open up, to share their feelings, to embrace vulnerability.
But the author claims that this is a devastating trap. When men actually follow this advice and display vulnerability, they are severely, often permanently, penalized.
The examples he uses here are brutal. He cites corporate studies and anecdotal evidence suggesting that when male CEOs show genuine emotion, express deep insecurity, or cry during public addresses, their company's stock inevitably drops.
And they permanently lose the respect of their boards and their male peers. The marketplace punishes their vulnerability.
But the author claims the penalty is even worse in romantic relationships.
Yeah, the therapy trap.
He argues that men who confess their deepest fears or insecurities to their wives, often at the urging of couples therapists, frequently find their partners filing for divorce shortly after.
Riker claims that despite what women explicitly state they want, an emotionally available, vulnerable partner, their deep evolutionary firmware biologically repels them from men who display weakness or an inability to handle stress.
It's a completely unresolvable paradox, according to the book. Riker posits that true stoicism, emotional control, and unshakable competence are the only traits that are actually rewarded by the real world, both in the boardroom and in the bedroom.
Progressive therapists might preach vulnerability, but the author argues that acting strong gets you labeled an oppressor, while showing vulnerability gets you discarded as weak and useless. It is a lose-lose situation designed to keep men off balance.
Riker argues that this double bind isn't just an accident of modern psychology. It is heavily reinforced by what he calls media mind control.
The pop culture angle.
He dedicates a significant portion of the book to claiming that pop culture and mainstream entertainment don't just reflect societal changes, they actively engineer them, deliberately degrading male authority as a form of cultural propaganda.
He traces the origins of the famous bumbling dad trope all the way back to Madison Avenue, advertising focus groups in the 1980s and 90s.
Riker claims that advertising executives realized that female consumers, who make the vast majority of household purchasing decisions, felt less guilty about spending money when their husbands were portrayed on television as incompetent, lovable fools who couldn't manage a basic task.
This specific advertising strategy, the author argues, bled over into mainstream narrative media, leading to the proliferation of characters like Homer Simpson or even Daddy Pig in the children's show Peppa Pig.
These paternal figures are constantly shown as clueless, lazy, and in desperate need of being rescued or managed by the superior competence of their wives or young daughters.
Riker argues this is not harmless slapstick comedy. It is deliberate, repetitive social engineering designed to erode the cultural respect for fatherhood and traditional male authority from the time a child is old enough to watch a screen.
And he contrasts this media engineering with the actual desires of the consumer market by looking at modern cinema.
The box office numbers don't lie, according to him.
He points out the highly publicized box office struggles of recent female-led girl boss action movies. He specifically targets Marvel's Phase 4, where he claims traditional masculine heroes were systematically replaced, mocked, or diminished to elevate female characters who were portrayed as flawless and instantly competent without struggle.
The author contrasts those expensive cinematic failures with the massive billion-dollar global success of a film like Top Gun: Maverick.
According to Riker, the overwhelming popularity of that movie proves that global audiences are absolutely starved for unapologetic traditional masculine narratives.
They want stories where men are highly competent, risk-taking, brotherhood-oriented, and undeniably heroic.
He uses this contrast to argue that you simply cannot socially engineer away the deep human desire for classic male archetypes, no matter how hard Hollywood tries.
That analysis of culture brings us to Section 3 of our roadmap, dealing with legal castration and what the author aggressively titles the alimony industrial complex.
This section is really intense.
It is. If the culture war is the soft power attacking men, Riker views the family court system as the hard, punitive power. He does not view family courts as arbiters of justice or child welfare. He frames them as a $50 billion racket designed to systematically strip men of their accumulated assets and separate them from their children.
The author builds this case using very specific legal and demographic statistics. He points out that women initiate up to 80% of all no-fault divorces in the West.
80%.
Yet, despite being the party that initiates the dissolution of the family, he claims that women receive primary physical custody of the children in 80% to 90% of all cases.
Riker finds this statistical outcome deeply unjust and inherently biased. He highlights this injustice by citing extensive sociological data showing that shared 50-50 parenting is unequivocally better for the psychological development, educational outcomes, and future success of children.
He argues that the courts know this data exists, but actively ignore it to maintain the current power dynamic.
Riker takes aim at the legal framework itself, arguing that it is fundamentally unconstitutional in its application.
He points to the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, as well as landmark Supreme Court cases like Troxel v. Granville, arguing that the fundamental constitutional rights of fathers to parent and have access to their children are routinely, casually ignored by family court judges.
He claims these courts still operate on outdated 19th century tender years doctrines, the unwritten assumption that mothers are inherently superior, mystical caregivers.
The result, he argues, is that fathers are instantly demoted from essential parents to mere financial providers, or, as he bluntly puts it, walking ATMs who only exist to fund the household they were evicted from.
This alleged systemic bias extends into what is easily the darkest chapter of the book. His claims regarding false accusations and paternity fraud, which he sees as the ultimate destructive weaponization of the legal system.
The Brian Banks story.
He shares the truly harrowing story of Brian Banks to illustrate his point. Banks was a highly recruited high school football star whose dream of a lucrative NFL career was instantly destroyed when a female classmate falsely accused him of rape.
The specific mechanics of the Banks story are what Riker focuses on. Banks spent 5 years in prison and years on the sex offender registry. It was only after his release that he managed to secretly record his accuser, admitting that the entire encounter was consensual and that she had fabricated the rape charge because she was afraid of getting in trouble with her mother.
Riker uses this tragic destruction of a young man's life to argue that the modern belief all women cultural narrative completely obliterates the fundamental legal concept of male due process.
He asserts that the justice system actively operates on a presumption of male guilt the moment an accusation is made.
And he applies that same concept of a rigged legal system to the highly controversial topic of paternity fraud.
Citing data from genetic testing laboratories, the book claims that in contested paternity cases, situations where a man already suspects he might not be the father, up to 30% of alleged fathers discover they are not biologically related to the child.
30%. What outrages the author is not just the infidelity, but the legal response to it. He details how family courts will often still force these defrauded men to pay 18 years of child support, even after DNA proves they are not the father.
The courts do this under the legal guise that the man has already established himself as the psychological parent, and cutting off funds would harm the child.
Riker views this doctrine as literal state-sanctioned theft. He argues it punishes innocent men for the hypergamous choices of women who sought out different, perhaps more attractive genetics, but rely on the deceived, stable man for financial provision. The state, he claims, enforces this deception.
So a reader has to ask, why does the author think the system operates in such a blatantly biased way?
All of the money.
To answer this, Riker introduces the theory of the motherhood extinction versus corporate collusion. He argues that there is a massive structural financial incentive for both the state and major corporations to actively destroy the nuclear family.
The economic logic he outlines is actually quite straightforward. He claims that consumer-driven corporations absolutely profit from broken homes.
When a nuclear family divorces, that single household fractures into two. Suddenly, that family requires two of everything to function.
They need 2 refrigerators, 2 mortgages or rent payments, 2 sets of living room furniture, 2 internet bills.
By incentivizing divorce, Riker argues, the system effectively doubles consumer spending and traps both parents in a cycle of endless labor to afford their newly separated lives.
Furthermore, he looks at the government's role in this. The author claims that state child support agencies actually collect federal financial incentives, known as Title Full EVD funds in the U.S., based directly on the amount of child support they are able to extract from non-custodial parents who are overwhelmingly fathers.
This, Riker argues, creates a massive perverse incentive for the legal system. It becomes highly profitable for the state to separate children from their fathers and maximize the support orders, transforming family breakdown into a highly lucrative, self-sustaining $50 billion industry that feeds entirely off male labor.
This naturally transitions us into the 4th major section of the book, chemical sabotage and the sex strike.
Up to this point, the author has argued that the attack on men is cultural, educational, and legal. But here he argues that it is also literal physical emasculation happening at a microscopic biological level.
He asks us to look at the environmental and chemical warfare being waged on male biology. The data point that anchors this entire section is deeply concerning, regardless of your politics.
Riker points to a major peer-reviewed meta-study indicating that human sperm counts across the Western world have dropped by a staggering 59% since 1973.
59%. Riker utterly rejects the idea that this is just a tragic, unforeseen accident of modern industrial life.
He frames it as the result of a chemical environment that has become actively, fundamentally hostile to testosterone and healthy male physiology. He names several specific culprits in the book, focusing heavily on endocrine disruptors.
One of his primary targets is synthetic estrogen, specifically the runoff from hormonal birth control pills.
He cites environmental studies showing that the municipal tap water in major cities like London carries massive, measurable amounts of this excreted synthetic estrogen.
The concentration is so high that researchers have found fish swimming downstream from wastewater treatment plants are actually developing intersex organs. Male fish literally growing ovaries where their testes should be.
Riker uses this highly visual example to ask a provocative question. If this water is rapidly feminizing aquatic life, what exactly is it doing to the biology of the human males who are drinking it every single day?
He extends this critique to modern, highly processed diets and the consumer goods we use daily. The book claims that soy isoflavones, which are incredibly prevalent in modern food processing and act as phytoestrogens mimicking estrogen in the human body, can drop a man's testosterone levels by up to 19% if consumed daily.
He also targets the widespread use of BPA plastics, which
Right.
line our canned goods and water bottles, noting that they heavily leach estrogenic compounds directly into our food supply.
The overarching narrative Riker builds here is that the modern industrial environment is literally chemically castrating men from the inside out.
He argues this chemical assault is making men softer, less aggressive, more prone to weight gain, and ultimately more compliant.
He views this as a deliberate, or at the very least, a highly convenient outcome for a society and a corporate structure that is actively seeking to suppress traditional disruptive masculinity.
This intense focus on hard biological reality seamlessly leads into his very aggressive commentary on transgender athletes, which he frames under the umbrella of fertility fraud.
He discusses several high-profile cases of biological men who transitioned and then competed in women's sports categories, specifically mentioning collegiate swimmer Leah Thomas and MMA fighter Fallon Fox.
The details he includes about Fallon Fox are particularly brutal. He notes that Fox, a biological male who transitioned, actually fractured the skulls of two different female opponents during professional mixed martial arts bouts.
The author uses these visceral examples to absolutely shatter the mainstream narrative that gender is merely a social construct.
Riker uses the utter dominance of transgender women in female sports as the ultimate, undeniable proof of his core thesis. He argues that the physiological advantages conferred by going through male puberty, the denser bone structure, the significantly larger lung capacity, the altered pelvic tilt, the greater upper body strength, and the higher concentration of fast-twitch muscle fibers, they are permanently baked into the body.
They cannot be erased or fully mitigated by subsequent hormone therapy or testosterone suppression.
He sees the inclusion of these biological males in women's sporting categories as a dangerous absurdity that exposes the utter lies of progressive gender theory.
To Riker, a fractured skull in an MMA ring proves that physical sexual dimorphism is a hard, unyielding reality of nature. He argues that pretending this biology doesn't exist doesn't elevate anyone, it just leads to the literal physical harm of women and the complete erasure of actual female athletic achievements.
Which brings us to the final stretch of our deep dive. Section 5, Reclaiming Destiny and the Masculine Restoration.
Riker has spent hundreds of pages painting this incredibly bleak dystopian picture of fundamentally captured institutions, biologically rigged dating markets, hostile courts, and literal chemical warfare.
The crucial question is, what are his proposed solutions? How does he suggest modern men navigate a system he believes is entirely designed to destroy them?
Riker's solution is not to petition the government or beg for cultural acceptance. He advocates for the construction of what he calls the new patriarchy.
The very first step for many men, according to the framework laid out in the book, is to fully embrace MGTOW men going their own way and completely commit to the marriage strike.
But the author is incredibly careful to frame this action. He insists that walking away is not a surrender. It is not a retreat out of bitterness or a refusal to take on responsibility.
Instead, he positions the marriage strike as a highly strategic, coldly rational ROI calculation. He directly advises men that if the legal system is rigged to arbitrarily confiscate your wealth and separate you from your children, and if the dating market is biologically rigged to view you as a disposable ghost, the only winning move in that game is to refuse to play it.
He gives a bizarre, almost sci-fi anecdote to illustrate the extreme end of this rational detachment. He points to the phenomenon of Japanese men who are legally marrying holograms, specifically the virtual pop idol Hatsune Miku.
Riker notes that while society mocks these men, maintaining a virtual holographic partner costs significantly less than navigating a modern marriage, and it carries absolutely zero risk of alimony, family court devastation, or emotional abuse.
He frames this extreme, highly unusual behavior not as madness, but is a completely logical, rational escape pod from the punishing demands of hypergamy and a hostile dating market.
However, the author's primary advice isn't just about avoidance or virtual escapism. It is heavily focused on intense personal fortification.
He urges a return to classic stoicism and the relentless pursuit of objective competence. Riker strongly advises his male readers to utterly reject the vulnerability trap pushed by modern therapists, HR departments, and mainstream media.
He argues that no one is coming to save men, and complaining about it is useless.
Instead, he calls for a massive return to the mastery of tangible physical skills that exist outside of the corporate HR-dominated email economy.
He specifically praises tradesmen, mentioning plumbing, welding, and electrical work as domains where objective reality and masculine competence still rule.
He advocates for martial arts, specifically highlighting jiu-jitsu as a way to reconnect with physical dominance and brotherhood. He also places a massive emphasis on physical strength, urging men to aggressively lift weights.
He specifically notes a physiological study claiming that performing heavy squats can acutely boost a man's testosterone levels by up to 40%.
The ultimate goal here is to forge a self-reliant, physically dangerous, and highly capable man who does not need the approval or the paycheck of the institutions that currently despise him.
Finally, the author outlines his grand vision of true male leadership, a concept he passionately calls dominance altruism.
Riker is attempting to completely reclaim the word patriarchy from its negative modern connotations of tyranny and oppression.
He argues that throughout human history, true masculine dominance was never about the petty oppression or subjugation of women.
Riker defines dominance altruism by comparing it to historical archetypes. He points to the leaders of ancient hunter-gatherer tribes, or the commanders of WWII bomber crews flying over Europe.
These were men who possessed immense authority, but they used that dominance to take on massive risks and horrific responsibilities in order to ensure the survival and prosperity of their group. They led to serve.
The author argues that all of modern human civilization, the safe cities, the reliable power grids, the vast logistical networks, rests entirely on the shoulders of men who are willing to carry what he calls the Atlas tax.
The Atlas tax is the biological and social burden of undertaking dangerous labor, providing uncompromising protection, and building the infrastructure of reality.
The book's final, resounding conclusion is that modern society is currently crumbling, and our institutions are failing, precisely because men have been told to drop this burden or have been punished for trying to carry it.
Riker asserts that the only way to rebuild a functional, thriving world is for men to voluntarily, unapologetically embrace their biological destiny, build parallel structures outside the current system, and lead with dominance altruism once again.
It is a sweeping, aggressive, and entirely unapologetic vision that seeks to completely dismantle the last 50 years of social and feminist theory, demanding a hard return to strict, biologically determined gender roles.
And that brings us to the end of our incredibly deep dive.
We have taken an intense, detailed journey through Conrad Riker's worldview today. We mapped out his evolutionary arguments regarding female hypergamy and male provision. We explored his harsh, unyielding critiques of modern academia, corporate diversity initiatives, and the family court system.
We looked at his claims regarding the chemical sabotage of male biology, and we ended with his aggressive call for a new, unapologetic patriarchy based on competence and dominance altruism.
We want to reiterate to you, the listener, that our goal today was to impartially unpack these highly charged, red-pilled arguments directly from the source material. We are not endorsing these views. We are breaking down the mechanics of this perspective so you can fully understand exactly what this growing segment of the cultural landscape believes and argues.
Regardless of where you personally stand on the political or cultural spectrum, it is absolutely essential to understand the underlying logic, the historical interpretations, and the specific data points these movements use to build their worldview. You cannot engage with the modern culture war without understanding these core arguments.
Now, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, to mull over something that builds on the source material we just covered, but pushes it a step further into the future. If human biology and the innate male drive for risk, provision, and physical conquest are as deeply hardwired and unalterable as the author claims, and if our modern institutions continue to sanitize, automate, or legally penalize those exact domains, what entirely new frontiers or subcultures might men inevitably create in the coming decades?
If the traditional avenues of masculine expression are permanently closed, how and where will that primal energy manifest to fulfill this biological imperative outside of the current societal framework?
That is a fascinating question, and answering it will likely shape the major cultural and societal conflicts of the next generation.
It certainly will be the space to watch.
That is all the time we have for today's massive exploration. Remember, please take a second to like and subscribe to the deep dive so you never miss an episode. If you want to dig into the source material yourself and read his full arguments, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook.
And one final reminder, be sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest essays.
Thank you so much for listening, for joining us on this complex journey, and as always, keep questioning everything.